Today, the Privileges Committee of MPs throws the book at Boris Johnson for deliberately misleading Parliament. The former Prime Minister says the report is a charade. So what does it mean for him, the Conservative Party and the government? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative peer Stuart Jackson, SNP MP Richard Thompson, political strategist Joe Tanner and Ellie Mae O'Hagan from the Good Law Project. Today, the committee unanimously concludes that Boris Johnson deliberately misled MPs.
Is this the end, Mr Johnson? Have you run out of road?
The committee says the former Prime Minister should have got a 90-day suspension had he still been an MP, and effectively barred him from the parliamentary estate.
Boris Johnson lied. He lied to MPs, he lied to the people of this country.
Well, I think we're absolutely appalled. This seems very vindictive, very spiteful, and I would say a complete overreach.
Boris Johnson says the committee's report is tripe. MPs will debate it on Monday.
It will be a painful process and a sad process for all of us. But all of us must do what we think is right.
So is it over for Boris Johnson? Also today...
For those homeowners that are worried, what they can do is ask for help through the Support for Mortgage Interest Payment Scheme, which has recently been adjusted. That support is there available for them.
Rishi Sunak says struggling homeowners can get help. We'll find out more. Well, it's been some time in coming, but we have the report, and many of us has read as much as we possibly can, and it's an excoriating demolition of Boris Johnson, who this time last year was Prime Minister, presiding over an 80-seat majority. His fall has been politically jaw-dropping. Let's talk to the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason. We expected it to be damning. Chris, not least because Boris Johnson gave us an idea of what the conclusions were himself. But this is of a different magnitude.
It really is, Joe. You can pick your superlative of choice this lunchtime. Blimey, crikey, or something a little less broadcastable. This is an extraordinary, devastating, brutal indictment by a committee of his peers of Boris Johnson's character and his conduct. And as you say, we knew it was going to be damaging. We knew it was going to be devastating for Mr Johnson because he had preempted the publication of this report with his announcement and his subsequent statement starting last Friday night. But even given that, the magnitude of the breadth and the depth of the critique is really quite something to read. So take the sanction. Yes, it might seem academic given that he has left the House of his own accord, but take the proposed sanction that the committee was suggesting to fellow MPs of 90 days. Remember, it only had to be in double figures to trigger the process that could have led to a by-election and could have led to voters kicking him out of Parliament. Instead, they were suggesting 90 days. Then, as you read through it, I can't claim to have read every single syllable, although I'm a considerable way through now. Again and again and again, they take particular incidents during Partygate and assemble alongside the facts that the committee have managed to establish. And on top of that, they are particularly critical of Mr Johnson's conduct, firstly, in front of the committee when he offered oral testimony a couple of months ago, and then his conduct on Friday and in the days since. In other words, him going public with his critiques of the committee. You'll remember he described it as a kangaroo court before its publication today, before it could speak for itself, or indeed the committee members could speak for themselves. Incidentally, I don't think they will speak publicly for a couple of days to allow people to absorb the content of it. But whatever, as I say, superlative you pick, it won't be an exaggeration to describe how damaging this is to Boris Johnson, and therefore posing the question if there is any way back for him whatsoever.
Well, that is the question that I'm going to pose. I mean, it looks on the face of it when you take in what you have said about the sort of breadth, the scale of it, and effectively he's been called a liar, really, by the committee. He's come out fighting, though, Boris Johnson. He came out fighting when he had sight of it last Friday, and he has yet again, we'll look at his statement in a bit more detail, saying the report's beneath contempt. But is there really any way back for him to frontline politics?
Well, every tackle from Boris Johnson has been a two-footed tackle for the last couple of days, including, as the committee effectively points out, before the match had begun, before the report came out. We have some sense now of why he was so angry and his language was so full of vitriol last Friday night, because he had seen this. My understanding is, by the way, that when he did see this last week, it didn't actually say what the length of this proposed sanction and suspension would be. It just merely said it would be in double figures, and so likely to lead to a process where there would be a by-election. It's got massively bigger as a result of his behaviour in the last few days. What about then the future for Boris Johnson? Let me just insert a brief caveat before I get to that. Remember what this is really about. Yes, it's about Boris Johnson. Yes, it's about what went on during COVID and his accounts of what went on during COVID. It's actually about a bigger principle. It's about integrity and honesty and believability and accountability and ultimately truth. Whether what public figures say out loud can be believed, if you like, the bedrock upon which democracy and wider society functions. As far as Mr. Johnson is concerned, never underestimate his capacity to generate attention and to make noise. Speaking to Conservative MPs, some say, perhaps hope, that there is nothing more ex than an ex-MP, and Boris Johnson is now an ex-MP. In the view of another minister, they said Boris Johnson has had a lifetime's capacity to fall down manholes head first and land on his feet. The thing is, this one is one heck of a manhole.
Sounds painful. Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor, thank you very much. Stuart Jackson, let me start with you, because it is a brutal indictment, to use Chris Mason's words, of Boris Johnson's character and conduct. But that question, have we got to the truth of what happened and what Boris Johnson actually did and covered up, as the committee sees it?
Well, I don't think this report is the truth. I think it's a sham court. It is a kangaroo court. The people there they're politicians. They are masquerading as a quasi-judicial process. There were people with axes to grind. There wasn't due process, in my opinion. He has been treated unfairly. This process would not have lasted 10 minutes, even in a magistrate's court. And there are people there who were out to get him. And what this is effectively is revenge for Brexit dressed up as a quasi-judicial process. And can I just say finally on this little bit, that when Parliament descends into the idea of lawfare, of using the law, inverted commas, to drive its opponents out, people that they couldn't beat at the ballot box, we're on a very slippery slope. And just finally, the Republicans tried it in trying to impeach Clinton in 1995. It backfired on them, and I suspect Parliament will be poorer for this process at the end of it.
Richard, what do you say in response to that?
It's difficult to know where to begin, really, but I think the real contempt here is the contempt that has been shown throughout by Boris Johnson to Parliament. First of all, in coming to Parliament and quite clearly saying things that were not the truth, maintaining his position even once the lies were exposed, and then once they decided to go through this committee of the House, the Standards Committee, he has done his best to mislead and misdirect, as they have found themselves, and then try to demonise the committee, orchestrating attacks on the committee members and trying to discredit the conclusions before the committee has had a chance to report. That is a real slippery slope if that's the sort of behaviour that is allowed to stand. And I think every member of the Conservative Party in the House of Commons has to examine their conscience when we come to vote on this on Monday. Are they prepared to stand for that? Because for too long, too many of them were allowed themselves to enable, to excuse and sustain Boris Johnson's political career long beyond any point where it should have been allowed to continue. And quite frankly, I think most people reading this will think that it's good riddance to Boris Johnson.
Have we got to the truth with this report, Jo?
I'm not sure we'll ever fully get to the truth. I think there are multiple accounts and views of what happened, and even the committee talk about going and doing a site visit to see rooms and to see what the view was. That the reality of this report is that the committee have taken a view of how Boris conducted himself in Parliament and how he answered questions, statements he made. And I think I don't agree, I'm afraid, with Stuart. I think actually they probably did. Some of the members of that committee will have done this with a heavy heart. I'm not convinced that they were all politically motivated. Maybe some were, but there's 7 people on that committee. I think to suggest that the whole thing was orchestrated is very, very difficult. So whether we'll ever fully get to the truth on a lot of things around COVID and that period, I'm not sure. Perhaps it will never happen, but we're probably the closest we've got to finding out what really happened. It's the closest we'll probably get.
Ellie?
I mean, the truth is that Boris Johnson has lied consistently throughout his entire career. He's been reprimanded twice for lying. He was implicated in beating up a journalist, which is something that Eddie Mair brought up to him on the BBC 10 years ago, calling him a nasty piece of work.
And on this report?
Well, I think this is entirely consistent with Boris Johnson's character. That's the point that I'm trying to make. In the 1980s, Eton wrote to Boris Johnson's father and said that he feels affronted when he's expected to play by the rules that all of the rest of us live by. So him throwing a massive tantrum like a big baby because he's been caught out is entirely in keeping with the way that he's behaved throughout his entire life. And I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is what kind of media and what kind of governing party allows someone like that to take power in the first place? There should have always been a lot more scrutiny on Boris Johnson. Otherwise, we wouldn't have got to this point in the first place. And I think what we really need to do now is look at our political system, look at our media and say what mistakes were made, what facts were ignored, and what facts were elevated above others, and how did we get to this point when a serial liar who throws a temper tantrum could have the highest office in our country?
We'll come and discuss that detail. I'm sure that you, Stuart, would want to rebut some of what Ellie has said. Let's actually look at parts of the report, the evidence gathered by the committee and the evidence they used to conclude that Boris Johnson had deliberately misled MPs. Jonathan Blake, the BBC's political correspondent, is there and has the report up on a screen. Jonathan, take us through some of the evidence that was used to make that conclusion.
Hi, Joe. Yes, here it is, all 108 pages, 30,000 words or so of this lengthy report from the Privileges Committee. Just on page 9 here to start with, you can see their broad summary of their findings and the recommended sanction for Boris Johnson, 90 days suspension for repeated contempts and for seeking to undermine the parliamentary process, they say, by deliberately misleading the House, deliberately misleading the committee, breaching confidence, impugning the committee and undermining the democratic process and being complicit in a campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation by the committee. And again, that punishment involving not giving Mr Johnson a former member's pass. So on that central claim that he deliberately misled MPs, let's look in a bit more detail, as you ask, about why the committee has come to that conclusion. They say on several points that he deliberately misled the House. In coming to that conclusion, they considered his repeated and continuing denials of the facts. For example, his refusal to accept that there were insufficient efforts to enforce social distancing. Just bear with me as we scroll through. Gatherings where a lack of social distancing is documented in official photographs. B, the frequency with which he closed his mind, the committee says, to those facts and to what was obvious. C, the fact that he sought to rewrite the meaning of the rules and guidance to fit his own evidence. And they use the example here of his assertion that imperfect social distancing was perfectly acceptable when there were no mitigations in place, rather, they say, than cancelling a gathering or holding it online, and his assertion that a leaving gathering or a gathering to boost morale was a lawful reason to hold a gathering. The committee clearly disagrees. And this final point, his own after-the-event rationalisations, as they put it. For example, the nature and extent of the assurances he received, the words used, the purposes of the assurances, who they came from, and the warning he received about from Martin Reynolds, who was his principal private secretary, and his failure to take advice from others whose advice would have been authoritative. Finally, his view about his own fixed penalty notice, that he was baffled, they say, as to why he received it, is instructive. So an insight there into why the committee has come to this conclusion that Boris Johnson not only misled MPs, because he accepts that he did that, but he did so deliberately.
Right, we were expecting a sanction perhaps of 10 days, a suspension of 10 days from the House. It jumped to 90 massively. Why?
Well, there's some clues in the report as to why the committee has come to that conclusion. And it is, as you say, Joe, a very lengthy suspension, and more than most of us, frankly, I think it's right to say, were expecting. And here on page 68, the committee goes into some detail to explain why that has happened. And I'll read you some of what they say. Their final conclusions: Mr Johnson's resignation as an MP, they acknowledge, renders it impossible for a sanction of suspension to be imposed, but they draw attention to events of Friday the 9th of June, and before that, that's when Boris Johnson resigned as an MP, they had agreed, they explained, to recommend a suspension long enough to engage the Recall of MPs Act, effectively 10 days.
Yes.
In the light of Mr Johnson's further contempt, they say, we put on record that if he'd not resigned his seat, we would have recommended that he be suspended from the service of the House for 90 days. So it's what he did after he resigned as an MP, or on that day, and his statements about the investigation and the inquiry since then, that have led them to increase that recommended punishment to 90 days,
Yes.
And also the removal of his pass. And that relates to his language towards the committee. Just briefly to highlight Boris Johnson's letter to the committee back in March, in which he says, I have the utmost respect for the integrity of the committee and all its members and the work that it's doing. And they go on to highlight his language since, talking about kangaroo courts and witch hunts, which the committee argues is further undermining its work and its authority, which is one reason why they've gone for that severe punishment.
Jonathan Blake, thank you very much. Do you think it's excessive?
Oh, absolutely.
Why?
It's spiteful, it's disproportionate. You know, this idea that you can't defend yourself in public and your supporters in Parliament can't defend themselves and you have to be driven out of Parliament and your supporters have to be threatened with privilege actions by this committee.
But he did make public statements, didn't he, before the report was actually published?
But it's reminiscent of a Central American banana republic,
Really?
of getting rid of people who are defending him. He had the whole machinery of the state attacking him, every aspect of him. He's a right to defend himself. And you look at Margaret Ferrier, who travelled to Scotland and back
MP, yeah.
with COVID, came in and debated in Parliament with COVID.
She wasn't
gets
Prime Minister, of course.
No, but that's not the point.
Well, no, but she wasn't Prime Minister.
Joe, this is not about being Prime Minister. It's being an elected member of the... the privilege... No, I think I know what the Privileges Committee is about, Ellie.
Right, well, hang on, let Ellie respond,
It is about being a member of Parliament. That's what the Privileges Committee is about. She got 30 days, he's getting 90.
He did have... Yeah, but that's because he undermined the committee's report,
Well,
so
in
say the
their
committee.
opinion.
Well, Richard, what do you say to the fact that he's been driven out, Stuart says, that it is excessive? I mean, it is a very major sanction.
Exactly, and I think that reflects the seriousness of the situation. And comparisons with Margaret Ferrier are entirely bogus. Because, I mean, this isn't... I think everybody in the country, nobody can fail to have an opinion, one way or the other, on how Boris Johnson behaved in the pandemic. This is about the way he behaved in Parliament and towards the committee. And his behaviour throughout this, frankly, has been utterly disgraceful and shameful. It's the most Trumpian to the power of 10 tactics that he and his supporters, many of them, have used to try and discredit the entire proceedings, and in the process they've inflicted significant damage on Parliament's reputation. But above all, the person who comes out of this with the greatest damage to their own reputation is Boris Johnson himself, and he has shown exactly why he is completely unfit for any kind of public office, past, present or future.
He's come out fighting. Let's just show you part of the statement, Joe and Ellie. The committee now says that I deliberately misled the House. This is rubbish. It is a lie. He goes on to say, and the arguments in the report are so threadbare that it belongs in one of Bernard Jenkins' nudist colonies. Bernard Jenkins, the Conservative MP that was on the committee, also happens to be, accordingly to Boris Johnson, a nudist. This report is a charade. It is for the people of this country to decide who sits in Parliament, not Harriet Harman, who chaired the Privileges Committee and was tasked with looking at this. What do you make of that statement from Boris Johnson? Wise?
It's unusual, actually. If you actually look at, all of the issues that have come up for Boris over the years, his strategy has always been to stay quiet. He actually very rarely would come out and defend anything, attacks on his personal life, things he might have got up to. His strategy was always to be quiet, and this was a very different strategy he took. And the report itself does mention that the committee felt compelled to do something else because he was Prime Minister and not just a Member of Parliament. They actually talk about the fact that it was an unprecedented situation and that, to some extent, being Prime Minister almost meant he was held to a higher standard, I think was something in the phraseology that they use. So it is extraordinary. I actually feel sorry for some of the members of the committee because they're not able to defend themselves. They haven't come out speaking. What astonishes me is we used to have honourable members and we used to refer to each other in the Commons as honourable members, and there's been nothing honourable about any of this process, which I think is really sad.
I mean, you worked with Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London, and you say this is not like him to behave like this. So what do you think's prompted this determination to try and pull the whole thing apart?
Well, I mean, Gitto Harry on his podcast, that Boris's former spokesperson, former advisor, has talked about how upset Boris was last year. And I think there is a degree of... There's been a lot of events where he hasn't necessarily put forward his position. One of the saddest things about the fact that he has resigned as an MP means that he won't be able to go on record in the House and have that moment where people that resign normally from roles, they have that moment where they're on record talking. And so instead, the only place he can really do that has been the media, so the statements that have come out. And I presume he's taken some advice on what he says on those. But the committee were rightly very upset. And, I mean, apparently one even had extra security brought in because they were worried about how they were being treated. And that's no way for politicians to be behaving.
Do you think it's an appropriate sanction, 90 days, and barring him from the parliamentary estate?
I have to say I was pretty shocked. I thought it was pretty tough. But I think they also were pretty angry at the way that the whole process was being... This is a man who said he was happy with the process and was happy to participate only a few months ago, and then changed it to being a kangaroo court and said that that's what he'd heard other people had told him it was a setup. So his position changed on it. If he really didn't want to participate with it because he felt it was set up against him, maybe that's the action that should have been taken.
But it's double standards. Where was the Privileges Committee into misleading Parliament on the Iraq War, the death of thousands of people?
But there was a massive inquiry, wasn't there?
Actions of Alistair Campbell and Blair in lying to Parliament.
There were massive inquiries about that, Stuart, weren't there?
The Privileges Committee...
Let me just explain, though, for you. The Privileges Committee is Parliament's response to investigating these sorts of claims. Yes, by an MP, but also a Prime Minister. They are set up to look at enforcing any allegations of contempt. That's what the Privileges Committee does. That's what it was set up for. It has a majority of Conservative MPs. Just so people understand, it wasn't suddenly constituted after the event.
They're politicians. They've axed to the grind. Bernard Jenkins has allegedly attended a lockdown party in December of 2020. He's completely silent today and hasn't responded to that. Harriet Harman, was on public record being extremely critical of Boris Johnson before she was appointed to chair it. This would not have lasted, in terms of due process, 10 minutes in any other so-called court of law.
Does this undermine, to some extent, what the committee has done? Will they appear vindictive for the reasons that Stuart has said?
No, I don't believe that they do. I mean, I really wish to take issue with the point that Johnston's making about it's for the people to decide who goes into Parliament. Of course it is. But the point is that the sanction that's recommended would not in and of itself have removed them. They would have required to have been a petition amongst the electorate of Uxbridge. And he has run away from the consequences of this rather than face the judgment of his peers in Parliament and subject himself to the electorate of Uxbridge if that petition threshold could be crossed. And it's just the final cowardly act of somebody who has finally been forced to face up to the consequences of their actions and has chosen to try and run away from it as far as they can.
Well, that's true, isn't it?
No, I think he just had... At the end, he just had no faith in the system to deliver a fair and impartial judgment on his actions, and I think that's the situation that he was facing.
But what
when he
would be
got the
fair?
report.
Do we get into having outside bodies that then scrutinise MPs? Because for years we've complained that MPs regulate themselves and that they get away with all sorts, and then you have a situation where actually MPs are sitting in judgment on each other, and then we don't like it either. So what is the answer? Because I think if you start getting into outside bodies getting involved, I suspect everyone will get very upset about that. So it has to happen somehow.
I think he has concluded that he has never been forgiven by a decent number, maybe a majority of people in the Commons for delivering Brexit. He is actually a consequential historical figure. If you look at the actions broadly speaking, around COVID at the beginning, in a very difficult period. He almost died, of course. If you look at the actions in preparing for the military action in Ukraine could have been overrun by now were it not for the decisions of Boris Johnson and Ben Wallace. And, of course, Brexit, which is a historic action that he was responsible for. He's a consequential figure. And some of those people on the committee, they don't like that. And the majority of Parliament, of course, in the House of Commons, have been hostile to his position on Brexit.
On Brexit?
I mean, I'm sorry, I really don't like being rude to fellow guests, but you sound crackers. Like, the things that you're saying are just crackers. Like, the idea that this is about Brexit, the idea that Britain is now a banana republic, it just sounds...
Well, coming from the Good Law Project, that's a bit rich from you.
It sounds
How many cases have you won in the High Court recently?
We won 3 in 5 cases of this year.
You've been on a losing streak quite recently.
Excuse me, let me finish my point. You spoke a lot, so I think it's polite to let me finish.
Go on, Ellie.
And I think it's really important, actually, if we're going to get personal, I think it's really important that viewers know that you tried to get into politics for a long time and actually you succeeded because Boris Johnson made you a life peer. And now you're coming on here...
I was elected 3 times.
It was
by
an
my
MP.
Constituents in the county.
Yeah, you were elected initially. You were elected initially.
And twice before that to public office. So get your facts right.
All right, well, let's try and take some of the personal out of it.
You were made
You'll
a life peer.
You'll have to rewind there because
you were made a life peer by Boris Johnson. That's true. Last year.
Yes.
And what I see here is somebody repeating the kind of cronyism that, yes, we at the Good Law Project challenge, which is why you don't like us.
And fail consistently.
No, succeed.
Well, hang on, answer the point, though, about the loyalty. Is it misplaced, your loyalty?
It's cronyism.
Is it cronyism?
It's not
It's
loyalty.
not cronyism.
Hang on, let him answer.
And it ill behoves you. You've never been elected to anything. And try and take people's money on false pretences, frankly, for legal cases that you know you're going to lose.
All right, it's enough of these two. Just stick to what we're talking about today.
I've been elected to Parliament. I was a special advisor. I was an elected councillor for 8 years. I had other careers before then. So please do try and get your facts right.
Hang on, Ellie.
I am loyal to Boris Johnson because I think that in totality...
Because he gave you a cushy job, which is often what happens in his government.
It's enough.
It's not a cushy job. I turn up, I attend, I vote, I ask questions, I hold the government to account, I criticise government.
But why didn't Boris Johnson... Hang on, why didn't Boris Johnson, though, Stuart, then, as Richard said, agree if the recall petition was going to happen and stand in a by-election?
Well, I think he
name?
would, and I think he may have had a good chance of winning. But
he quit.
Just say,
he quit, though,
to Ellie's challenge.
Lastly,
it's not about cronyism. I'm just looking at the totality of a man who won as Mayor of London twice against the odds, who was elected to Parliament, and in many respects was a very consequential figure. And to chase that person out of Parliament, I think, in a kangaroo court is wrong.
Right. I mean, a kangaroo court, by the way, has been used by the committee to say that other members, not necessarily of the House of Lords, but other members in the House of Commons will also, or should also, look at their behaviour in terms of undermining the very system that Parliament is based on. That is part of the report. Is there a risk that politicians like Stuart Jackson, other supporters of Boris Johnson, because of the nature of the sanction, will actually feel he has been unfairly treated?
I think that narrative would have been spun irrespective. It's almost like it was a monstrous offence to Mr Johnson's dignity in the eyes of some of his supporters that he was being held to account for any of this at all. And there's almost a sense coming through in some of the commentary that, the system has failed poor Mr Johnson, therefore we must dissolve the system and create a new one around this figure of consequence, who I think history will record was the man who ran away from the consequences and refused to face up to it. So, frankly, I think what this shows is that there is almost no length to which some of his supporters appear to be prepared to go in the heat of their anger at the moment to discredit the entire system, the entirety of Parliament and the processes that Parliament is there. And I think they need to be very, very careful about that. And as I said at the top of the programme, they need to examine their consciences, because for far too long they have sustained a man who is a serial liar in office long beyond where they should have done with that. They have enabled him and they have inflicted great damage in consequence, and they need to examine their consciences when they approach this vote on Monday.
Well, talking about you, Stuart, what would you do if you were in the House of Commons on Monday? Would you turn up and vote against this report?
Yes, for this reason, and I think Richard makes a reasonable point and others have as well. I do think he misled Parliament, but the key point is I don't think he deliberately misled Parliament. And if you read the report, he has produced evidence to say that he was advised about the efficacy of these events by officials.
And you think that's credible?
And members of Parliament.
The advisers were to blame for his own rules, for breaching his own rules.
To be honest, I haven't read his detailed rebuttal and I haven't fully read the report, but I do genuinely believe that what he was told, he believed to be the case.
Right. What do you think he'll do now? What do you think he should do now, Boris Johnson? Is it over politically?
I think there is I think the phrase I would go to is his current parliamentary career might be over, but I don't think his political career is. And I think, there are plenty of ways to engage politically. There are plenty of ways to still be a significant figure in the political world. Whether he decides to go down a future parliamentary route, I honestly don't know. But I think there needs to be some dust settled. And I think, he's got a book to write. He will have his own position to set out on a lot of issues with that book. I'm sure his publishers are hoping that he doesn't rejoin Parliament anytime soon and finishes the book, because he's had a history of being a bit late with books. I'm sure they'd be quite keen if he gets on with his memoirs and doesn't go and do something else too soon. But he's got, it seems to be incredibly busy. He's delivering speeches. He's been travelling a lot. He's still very active he's still very active on the Ukraine issue. So I don't think politically he's done by any means.
Right. I mean, you said that the system should change. Does this not show Parliament working perhaps at its best?
Well, I think, if you've got a headache, you take paracetamol and hopefully the paracetamol works. But what you really want is not to have the headache in the first place. And I think that's what we need to look at. And I know you're going to be cross with me, Jo, now, but I feel I need to respond.
No, you're not going to go back to making personal attacks, either of you, on each other.
No, I'm not going to make a personal attack, I promise. What I'm going to say is that Good Law Project has won 3 in 5 cases of this year.
But we're not talking about the Good Law Project in this particular instance.
OK.
But, all right, you've made your point.
It's great and you should support it.
Right,
I'll leave it there.
I mean, in terms of what he might or might not do next, do you think he should quit now? Politics altogether. It's over.
I think he should take a time out for a period of time, but I agree with Jo. She's spot on. I think he basically has a lot to contribute, I think, and in what capacity, I don't know. But I certainly think the stress he's been under and his immediate family, he will take a bit of time out, and it's for others to make their decision. In answer to your question, I would vote against the motion on the free vote on Monday if were I still in the House of Commons, because I don't think the case has been made definitively.
All right. We're going to take a moment away from the committee's report and Boris Johnson, because one of the big questions we looked at yesterday is whether this has all been a monumental distraction from other very important issues for voters, like the cost of living. Let me just show you this headline. Daily Mail, £13,200. That's how much extra you face paying on a £3,000 mortgage this year if interest rates hit 6%. And certainly that is being forecast. Interest rates are at 4.5% now, but they're saying it could go up to 5.75. Let's talk to our correspondent, Kevin Peachey. Kevin, is that what it's going to cost people?
Well, it's certainly going to cost a lot more. Obviously, people rolling off these fixed-rate deals, and actually, what we're seeing is a peak in that over the next 3 months. So more than 400,000 people going to be paying significantly more. Of course, they've become accustomed to very low interest rates over the last 10 years or so, and that's changed with interest rates rising, and now this sort of recent rise too, if they're one of those coming off in the next few months.
Right. We spoke to the Housing Minister, Rachel Maclean, yesterday on the programme after Prime Minister's questions, and she didn't seem to be totally clear on the help that is actually being offered by the government to mortgage owners. Let's have a listen.
The Prime Minister mentioned it,
which is
in PMQs. It's a mortgage support scheme.
And what's that?
Well, it's a
how
scheme
do people
where
apply?
I'm sure that there will be details on YouGov.
Rachel, you're the housing minister.
I am the housing minister.
You should know what this is.
Can you just let me finish? I do know what this is. Obviously, there are a huge amount of details depending on individual people's circumstances. What I would encourage them to do is go to gov.uk. They will be able to see all the support that is out there.
Well, go to gov.uk. And Kevin Peachey, I'm sure you've done exactly that.
Well, what's being referred to here is something I've written about for some time, support for mortgage interest. And as you'd imagine, it helps with mortgage interest payments. And it's UK-wide, but there are caveats, the most significant of which is that you need to be on a qualifying benefit, that may include universal credit, in order to receive this. And also, crucially, before 2018, this was a benefit, but since then, it's actually a loan with its own interest rate, albeit lower. So what generally happens is that people will repay that when they sell the property or perhaps when they die. And there are, that of course, housing is a devolved issue as well. So there are other support schemes around depending on where you live. So in Wales and Scotland, there are schemes at the critical end, if you like, of the scale, when if it looks as though your home's being repossessed, you are at risk of being homeless, then there's some support there.
All right.
But clearly, for these hundreds of thousands of people coming off their mortgages, there's not really too many good options at the moment.
Kevin Peachey, thank you. Is this the sort of thing the government should be offering or not?
Yes, I do, Joe. I agree that there should be targeted help for those people who are in the most difficult position financially. I think the bigger political issue, though, and I think there's a consensus on this, is that the Bank of England took its eye off the ball in terms of monitoring inflation.
The
Independent Bank of England, and is now using the weapon of monetary policy, interest rates, to try and overcorrect for the fact that they weren't really across the detail.
Although the government's very supportive, aren't they, saying that's the way to bring down inflation? Do you agree?
No, not entirely. I think most of the inflationary pressures that we're seeing are because of constraints on supply, which is increasing the cost in food, the increase in energy costs. And I think the problem of relying on monetary policy is that if all you have in your toolkit is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail, as the proverb goes. And I don't think that anyone is suffering in the cost of living crisis because they have too much money in their pocket that costs them too little to borrow.
What are they doing in Scotland? Although I'm a little bit reluctant to ask members of Parliament in case they don't know.
Well, you know, the levers around this financially rest primarily in Westminster, but certainly Scotland has some of the lowest housing costs at the moment. And I think that one of the things that we do need to do is look at the housing market and the lack of the affordable housing that is out there, which is the Scottish Government is doing its very best to tackle with an ambitious building programme.
I mean, people will be terrified about how much more they're going to have to pay if rates still go up and mortgage deals are pulled. I mean, at this point in time, should the government be doing more?
I think it's a really tricky position for the government. When I first had a mortgage, which was over 20 years ago, my rate was 7.75%. And apparently, according to my mum, that was a bit of a result because the mortgages she'd had were over 15%.
Well, because we had historic low rates.
Because we'd had historic low rates. So one of the bigger issues, and I know it's not the answer right now, I do think the government needs to look at support. Where you draw the line, I don't know. But the bigger question is, we as a country, citizens do not understand interest rates and credit very well because actually they would just go and borrow money for stuff that really they shouldn't be buying. I don't mean homes, but I mean anything from cars, things that they got the offer of 0% credit and then after a certain amount of time it would jump up. So people bought stuff they traditionally couldn't afford. And on homes potentially, may have overstretched themselves. Many actually benefited from low interest rates by having property portfolios that they've managed to make money out of. So the question is, you draw the line, then you probably create a lot more problems. But what we don't want to see, surely, are a lot of people that then are turfed out onto the street because they can't afford to live.
How important is this issue?
Well, it's really important. I mean, I'm hoping to buy a house myself this year. I certainly don't know anything about government help. I don't feel that the government is helping at all. And, you know, I think we're not just seeing the very poorest people suffer here. We're seeing people who are working class, middle class, being put in the position where they're worrying about paying their mortgages. And I think what we've got to remember is this comes off the back of stagnation of wages for over a decade, increasing inflation, and also really, really increasing house prices. In fact, that often seems to be the only thing that matters in politics, is that house prices are going up. So properties are getting more expensive, mortgages are going higher. People can't afford this. And in terms of the Bank of England, yes, the Bank of England is independent, but this is a political problem that requires a political solution. It means that government have to intervene, not just in the immediate term so that people can pay their mortgages now, but also in future to address the causes of inflation.
But does that mean that the government is always going to have to intervene on every issue and every problem?
Well, there is an issue of what they call moral hazard. You know, how much should government be involved? Coming back to what Richard said, I mean, inflation literally is too much money chasing too few goods. But I have to say I agree with Ellie, amazingly, on this. We are not doing enough on housing. We're not doing enough to house younger people. We need to sort out the planning system and build more homes. That is part of the whole issue of the broken mortgage market and the wider economy. But inflation and the relationship to interest rates is central to this, and that does lie with the Bank of England and not the government.
All right, before we actually go back to the issue of Boris Johnson, what is going to happen on Monday in terms of voting on the committee, I just want to talk about Nicola Sturgeon because the former First Minister was arrested at the weekend and then released without charge over the financial difficulties in the SNP. And there were calls for the current First Minister to suspend Nicola Sturgeon. You can see here in the Times, Humza Yousaf tells MSPs to back Nicola Sturgeon or quit. Was this a meeting that you had with Humza Yousaf where he told you and others to do that?
No. What I understand is that's a report that the Times seemed to have gleaned from a meeting of MSPs in Holyrood, SNP MSPs. Now, I've seen enough supposed leaks from my own group at Westminster appear
but is
at
it
times
true?
that I don't recognise.
Yeah, but is it true?
I wasn't there.
No, but have you heard about it?
What I understand, what I have heard about it is that the First Minister gave a message about unity, but and about the need to make sure that that we're talking about the issues that we need to talk about.
Should she be suspended?
No, I don't believe that she should be suspended because she's not been charged with anything. And if that situation changes, then my view might change. But I think there's a principle of natural justice here that unless there's a bigger reason to do so, she should be allowed to maintain her.
Well, her predecessor, Alex Salmond, who now heads up rival party Alba in Scotland, had this to say about Nicola Sturgeon.
I know what I would do, and I know what Nicola Sturgeon would have done with Nicola Sturgeon if there had been other people in other circumstances. Nicola Sturgeon would have suspended Nicola Sturgeon under these circumstances, no question about that. But look, what Humza decides to do with the internal discipline of another political party and not the one I lead is a matter for Humza.
Is he right? That's what Nicola Sturgeon would have done if it had been another politician in her party.
He may well be, but I don't think that would necessarily have made Nicola Sturgeon right. And I think Humza Yousaf has it absolutely right that everyone has a presumption of innocence. And as I say, you know, she has been released without charge. The police inquiry needs to
it's still going on,
to its
isn't it?
conclusion. It needs to be allowed to run its course. But until and unless there's a more compelling reason, I'm comfortable that Nicola Sturgeon remains a member of the SNP.
Right, well, in the last few moments, let's have a look at this tweet from Simon Clarke, former Cabinet Minister under Liz Truss. He was former Chief Secretary to the Treasury, I believe, under Boris Johnson. He says, I'm amazed at the harshness of today's report by the Privileges Committee. I believe Boris before and I believe him today. This punishment is absolutely extraordinary to the point of sheer vindictiveness, and I will vote against this report on Monday. What would you say to Simon Clarke?
I would encourage him, as I said earlier, to examine his conscience on this and consider the values and the actions and the personalities that sort of response to this absolutely excoriating report is sustaining, because it's basically saying that, you know, it's OK to turn up to Parliament and lie. And if we don't at least have that foundation of basic truth in terms of our dealings with one another on the floor of the House, if we don't have respect for the proceedings, then frankly we're in a very, very dangerous place.
I mean, it looks as if nearly a dozen Conservative MPs are criticising the report. What's that going to do to Parliament if there is seen to be, despite what Penny Mordaunt, the leader of the House of Commons, has said, it will be a sad and painful process if they do not support the system and the report that has come out from the Privileges Committee?
Well, then it would have been a whip vote. It's a free vote, like a social conscience vote. And just to correct Richard, it's not about someone lied, someone didn't lie. It's about the body of evidence contained within this parliamentary report. And if it isn't compelling and isn't demonstrably true for each individual, then they're entitled to vote for it as they wish, and it's their right to do so.
I mean, Rishi Sunak will have a decision. Should he not turn up? Should he vote and support the report or abstain?
Well, it's a free vote. It's like a free vote on abortion or a free vote on assisted suicide. I mean, that's the issue.
Difficult for the Prime Minister.
Yeah, and I mean, it's got this potential to lead to pretty much open warfare again. I mean, we've got this, you know, we've had a pretty difficult period for the Conservative Party where, you know, many of us last summer were talking about it being ungovernable and why would anyone want the job anyway when they were looking for a new leader. And the divisions are going to be opening again, but on different lines now. And is he going to back those 4 Tories that were on that committee that took the view that they've taken?
Well, we will find out, won't we, on Monday. Thank you to all of my guests for today. That is all we have time for. I will be back, of course, with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Bye-bye.
Okay, just noticed something. I didn't want to turn it off, that was annoying me. You know the thing I did yesterday with the whole new setup thing, no streaming? I noticed the audio's out of sync. Well, it looks like it to me. Not out of sync, I do it on the other one. Don't know why. It's like a millisecond or 2. It's fucking annoying me. Anyway, I won't be using that for question time. Because I'll just sit through it, just my OCD will kick and all some shit. Anywho, fuck the Tories, clearly. Always like to mention that. And yeah, they're full of shit. Just build council houses. You fucking idiots. Like, seriously. Good law project. You should do something useful. Fucking start crying about council houses. We need a national programme to build council houses. Loads of them. Fuck tons of them even. Stop giving people this mad idea that your home is your castle bollocks. The only people that benefits are the banks. Doesn't benefit you, you fucking idiots. Interest rates go up, yeah, no shit. And so will your mortgage. But if you just live in a normal house and the government controls the rent, it won't go up. And that's the mad thing. The amount of money you could save on your so-called fucking making other people rich. Because that's what basically you do when you get a mortgage. You're making somebody else rich, plus interest. Unless it's a new build, basically. But anyway, that's not the point. Point is, we need affordable houses, yes. The only affordable man that's ever around is the man with the bank card. That's called the government. It's so amazing that we actually pay taxes and these don't actually build houses for people to live in. They flog them to you. In fact, they've convinced you that the amount of money you pay in fucking council tax doesn't fucking go against fucking houses that you need to live in. We're gonna sell you them. You don't pay council tax for them to sell you the house. You pay council tax to fucking build council houses. It's ridiculous. Where's all that money going, one would ask? Because that's what I'm fucking next going to investigate. Where does the tax go? Where you should build houses? Where does that go? Who's getting that money? Because it's definitely fucking the council houses fucking people, is it? It's always, oh, we need to build houses so we can sell them. Fucking ridiculous. Where's that money? Banks, probably. Anyway, fucking waffling too fucking much as usual. I'll be back later tonight. Question time. We all know the fucking questions on question time tonight, don't we? It'll be Boris Johnson for a fucking hour, and then some retarded question at the end. Some shit. Anywho, we'll be back later. 10:30ish. So in about 5 hours, give or take.